Right, welcome back to US History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to continue talking about the 1920s. Goals for today, quite a few. We're going to discuss Warren G. Harding's strengths and weaknesses as president. We're going to talk a little bit about Calvin Coolidge, explain the factors that shape the new morality and changing role of women in the United States, describe the quote new Negro and the influence of the Harlem Renaissance, and if we can get to it, a few other things as well. So as a reminder, the 1920s was a decade of transformation. We talked a bit about the 1920s already. We're going to continue talking about it. Lots of change happening. Young people, especially in the cities, embraced a new morality that shocked their parents. This decade saw rebellion, innovation, and deep social conflict all at once. Changes especially affected women, African Americans, and overall the nation's values. So we see shifting values here. So the new morality. The goal of this was to break free from the past. After World War I, many young Americans felt disillusioned with the world. They wanted change. Young women rejected their mother's strict Victorian values and adopted the flapper lifestyle, which included shorter skirts, bobbed hair, makeup, freedom. They smoked and drank openly, which was very shocking behavior at the time. And flapper fashion emphasized straight lines, showing legs and ankles. This new look became almost universal among college-aged youth across America, and was fairly disapproved of by the vast majority of their parents. Dating and social life began to transform. Essentially, sex, rather than being taboo, was now promoted as natural, pleasurable, not necessarily wrong. The automobile gave teenagers and couples private spaces away from parents. Movie magazines and films showed romantic scenes influencing young people, and sexual behavior and customs became much more allowed than they had had before, which caused serious concern among older generations and religious leaders. We also see the rise of jazz music and entertainment during this time period. Jazz was born in the African American community and became uniquely American. It combined music like blues, ragtime, and other traditions into something new. It originally started in New Orleans and spread New Orleans and Chicago and spread beyond, far beyond. Many of the young people flocked to see the black jazz musicians performed, and jazz represented freedom, energy, and rebellion against old traditions. So music and dance at the time became a part of the way for the youth to rebel against cultural traditions. But the flapper lifestyle was not just about fun, it was also part of a larger women's rights movement. As we've mentioned before, in 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, and women wanted to match these political gains with social and cultural freedom. So they began joining clubs, attending colleges, entering professions in greater numbers. They wore new fashions and enjoyed new forms of entertainment and expression. The goal was to redefine what it meant to be a woman in America and directly challenge the Victorian era ideas about what a woman's role was, including how she looked, acted, behaved, dressed, and what she did in and outside of the home. Women's rights legislation continued into the 1920s. In 1921, the Shepherd-Towner Act was passed to support mothers and babies, and this provided $1.25 million for well baby clinics and nursing programs, which served to drastically reduce infant mortality. In 1923, Alice Paul drafted the Equal Rights Amendment to end sex discrimination. However, that was not eventually passed. Well, let me rephrase that. That was not passed during this time period, and it's going to be some time before we see that come around again in legislation. But the progressive era is starting to wind down in the 1920s. Essentially, a lot of women thought they'd won what they needed after getting the vote, and so some of these other things, like the Equal Rights Amendment, kind of stalled, and the funding for the Shepherd-Towner Act eventually ran out and was not continued. Women also began to work more and more in the workforce. This included jobs in domestic service, retail, healthcare, education, office, factories. However, they were still paid less for doing the same work as men. Employers claimed that women didn't need to support families, and so it was justified to pay them less. Single and unmarried women gained social acceptance in the workplace, but married women faced criticism for working, accused of seeking the money just for frivolous, fun spending income. But this economic independence of working gave women more power and choices in their lives and more control of their money. The Harlem Renaissance was an African American cultural awakening. Over 500,000 African Americans moved north during the 1920s to escape the Jim Crow laws in the South. The North offered schools and voting rights, but still had discrimination. Harlem was a neighborhood in Manhattan, New York, and it became the center of African American culture. And this cultural movement became known as the Harlem Renaissance. A huge wave of African American artists, writers, and musicians created independent Black culture, celebrated racial pride, and rejected just copying white American culture. And so this was a place in which um, being African American and being Black was embraced rather than something that you wanted to sweep under the rug. Some of the key writers of the Harlem Renaissance included Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. Um, these writers created powerful works that expressed Black identity and pride and rejected white supremacy. And so it was a written form and an artistic written form of pushing back against repression and discrimination. Let's see, we're going to skip that. Moving on to Prohibition. We've talked about Prohibition quite a bit, so we won't focus on that as much today. But basically, alcohol was outlawed. Americans continued to produce and drink alcohol so much that this was the amendment that was actually overturned and removed, and alcohol was then legalized again. Political divisions. Let's see. We already talked a lot about this. All right. Writers. Okay, so continuing with this theme of writing. And again, there's a lot more information on the Harlem Renaissance in the textbook if you want to deep dive into that. There was a group of writers referred to as the Lost Generation after World War I. A lot of young people felt disillusioned, disconnected. They were troubled by the war. They were troubled by religious fundamentalism. They were troubled by the Red Scare or this intense fear of communism. And these writers became known as the Lost Generation. They essentially criticized the middle class in American society in their writing. A lot of them lived overseas and felt alienated from American society. And they often expressed hopelessness, despair, and a sense that traditional values had failed. So this huge transition of the of American culture threw a lot of people for a loop, and it made them feel quite lost. F. Scott Fitzgerald was one of the most famous writer from the 1920s. He is the writer of The Great Gatsby, which you've most likely heard of, which was written to expose the emptiness behind the jazz age, right? All of this glamour just kind of hiding crap underneath. The novel depicts a millionaire living a reckless, immoral life. He's unscrupulous, coarse, in love with someone else's wife, and living this fast, extravagant lifestyle. And underneath, just doom and despair and misery, right? So this kind of like extravagant wealth in American culture of the 1920s is just kind of hiding people who feel lost underneath. Other famous Lost Generation writers include Ernest Hemingway. He wrote multiple novels and a novella, and eventually won a Nobel Prize for literature. And he kind of made American middle class life as pleasure seeking and mindless, right? So again, criticizing American values and American society. Not happy with how America's shifting during this time. The election of 1920 marked a major turning point in politics. The Democratic Party weakened after Theodore Roosevelt died and Woodrow Wilson became ill. Americans were kind of burnt out on progressive reforms, and they started to shift their goals. America wanted to return to normal and have a break from constant change. And so that affected who they chose to elect in 1920. So Warren G. Harding is elected as a Republican. The leaders of the Republican Party wanted someone they could control. And Warren G. Harding felt that Warren G. Harding fit this role. He promised healing and normalcy instead of revolution. And he was pretty easygoing, but often people would criticize him as a little bit empty. His speeches were referred to as rumble and bumble or flap and doodle. He enjoyed golf, alcohol, poker, and despite appearing weak, he was actually quite smart. So he won 61% of the popular vote, which was a huge majority at the time. He filled his presidential cabinet with wealthy businessmen who kind of shared his views. This included Herbert Hoover, who was a millionaire engineer and miner, Andrew Melton, Secretary of the Treasury, And they focused on cutting taxes and creating the country's first formal budgeting process to reduce debt after World War I. So, shifting the focus, President Harding worked hard to preserve peace through international cooperation. Although the U.S. Senate had rejected the Treaty of Versailles that ended and secured formal peace at the end of World War I, Harding secured his own individual formal peace with Germany and Austria, and convened the Washington Conference to bring world leaders together. So he kind of did his own thing. Unfortunately, these agreements fell apart in the 1930s, the next decade, when we started getting close to World War II. But temporarily, peace was effectively solidified. Despite the president's personal honesty, his administration became known for scandals. President Harding himself relied too heavily on advisors that were pretty unscrupulous and sometimes drank too much. His Secretary of the Interior leaked Navy oil reserves to private companies and received money in exchange for that, and then he was sentenced to prison for bribery. Colonel Charles Forbes was the head of the Veterans Bureau and stole the majority of $250 million that was set aside for the Veterans Bureau. And so these scandals damaged the presidency's reputation, his men. So President Harding died suddenly in August 1923 from a heart attack and a stroke while traveling, so his vice president became the president and ended these scandals. President Coolidge earned the nickname Silent Cal for being quiet and reserved. He believed in more of the Puritan work ethic. Work hard, save money, listen more than you talk. He had a famously clean image and said the business of America is business. He believed that the rich deserved their wealth and that poverty resulted from laziness. And he thought that the government should let business operate with minimal federal intervention. So kind of stepping back from the 19 teens and that sort of progressive reform era where the government was getting heavily involved in business and the economy, now we're kind of taking a step back. So President Coolidge was kind of famous for not doing much, depending on who you talked to. He's also very, very reserved, and that made him quite famous. His sort of lack of speech turned people off. In the 1924 election, Democrats were divided between two candidates. One person tried to resurrect the Progressive Party, and President Coolidge easily defeated both of them, especially since his opponent, basically his opposing political party, Coolidge was a Republican, and the Democrats were divided between two other people, and therefore that division helped Coolidge win the election. In 1927, he chose not to run for re-election, and so Republicans had to nominate a new candidate, and they chose Herbert Hoover. The Democrats also nominated a candidate, but the Democratic candidate was kind of everything that rural America opposed. So Hoover won easily in 1928. Little did he know, the Great Depression and stock market crash was just around the corner. But essentially, many people voted for Herbert Hoover thinking that they were at the beginning of a nice, easy, quiet time in American society. They were investing in the stock market, believing that, the prosperity of the 1920s would continue to happen. But that bubble's going to burst within a year. We're going to talk about that next.